The room went completely silent when the man on the phone said, "Yes, ma'am, we'll move forward under your command." I could feel Daniel's mother's eyes on me, sharp and confused. His father had just set down his fork, the faint clink echoing louder than it should have in that pristine dining room. No one said a word. Not yet. I stood there beside the hallway table, my back straight, my voice steady as I gave a final instruction. "Keep it contained until I get back. I'll review everything personally." "Yes, ma'am." The call ended. When I turned around, every face at that table had changed. And that's when I realized I hadn't planned for what came after. 3 hours earlier, I had stood in front of my closet holding 2 dresses. One was navy blue, tailored, the kind I wore to official functions when I needed to represent more than just myself. The other was older, soft cotton, faded at the seams, something I hadn't worn in years but couldn't quite throw away. I chose the old one. It wasn't a mistake, it was a decision. I slipped it on slowly, smoothing the fabric over my hips, catching my reflection in the mirror. No insignia, no polished shoes, no trace of rank or authority, just a woman in her late 30s with a simple dress and a calm expression. I pulled my hair back into a low, practical style, not the tight regulation bun I wore on base, but something softer, less defined. I left my makeup minimal, almost invisible. When I stepped out into the living room, Daniel looked up from his phone and paused. "You sure about that?" he asked. I smiled lightly. "It's just dinner." He hesitated. That small pause told me everything I needed to know. Daniel loved me. I didn't doubt that. But he also came from a world where appearances mattered. His parents had built a life around status, what you did, how you looked, who you knew. It wasn't cruel exactly. It was just ingrained. I was thinking, I said, slipping on my shoes, I might keep things simple tonight. Simple how? "I'll just tell them I work in administration for the Army." He blinked. "That's not exactly the full picture." "No," I said calmly, "it isn't." He studied me for a moment, searching my face. "Why?" I picked up my coat and met his gaze. "Because I want to know who they are before they know who I am." That answer didn't sit comfortably with him. I could see it in the way his shoulders shifted. "They're good people," he said, "just traditional." "I'm not trying to trick anyone," I replied. "I just don't feel like leading with a title tonight." He nodded slowly, though the doubt didn't leave his eyes entirely. "All right. But if it gets weird, I'll handle it." That part at least he believed. The drive to his parents' house took about 40 minutes. Late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway, turning everything gold and quiet. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly near mine, though neither of us spoke much. I didn't mind the silence, I used it. In my line of work, you learn to read situations before you step into them. You learn to listen for what isn't said. And tonight, I had a feeling there would be plenty of that. When we pulled into the driveway, I took a moment before opening the door. The house was large but not flashy. Clean lines, well-kept lawn, a place built to signal success without needing to shout it. The kind of home where expectations lived in the walls. Daniel walked around to my side and opened the door for me, a small gesture, polite, practiced. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded, always. His mother opened the door before we even knocked. "Daniel," she said warmly, pulling him into a brief embrace before turning to me. Her smile remained, but it shifted just slightly. "And you must be," she began. "Emily," I said, offering my hand. She took it, her grip light, her eyes scanning me in one quick, efficient glance. Dress, shoes, hair, no judgment spoken aloud, but I'd seen that look before. "Welcome," she said, stepping aside. His father stood in the living room waiting. He didn't move forward immediately. He simply observed as we walked in. "Dad, Daniel said this is Emily." I extended my hand again. "It's nice to meet you, sir." He shook it firmly. "You too." His tone was neutral, controlled. We exchanged a few polite words before moving into the sitting area. The room was arranged carefully, every piece of furniture in its proper place, every surface clean. His mother offered drinks. I accepted water. "So, Emily," she said after a moment, settling into her chair, "Daniel tells us you're in the military." "Yes, ma'am." "What do you do exactly?" There it was, the question. I kept my voice even. "I work in administration for the Army." A small pause followed. Not long, just enough. "I see," she said. His father leaned back slightly. "That must be Stable work. It is. He nodded once as if confirming something for himself. The conversation moved on, but the shift had already happened. I felt it in the way his mother's questions changed from curiosity to evaluation, in the way his father stopped asking follow-ups, in the subtle, almost invisible recalibration of expectations. Daniel noticed it too. I saw it in the tightening of his jaw. But he didn't say anything. Not yet. By the time we moved to the dining table, the tone had settled into something quieter, polite, controlled. His mother had prepared a full meal: roast chicken, vegetables, fresh bread. Everything placed just so. We sat. And I waited. Because I had seen this before. Not in homes like this, not exactly. But in rooms where people made decisions based on what they thought you were worth. The only difference was, this time I had chosen to let them. I picked up my fork steady as ever and smiled gently across the table. Thank you for having me. And somewhere deep inside I knew. This dinner was going to reveal far more than anyone expected. Dinner began the way most formal family dinners do, quietly, with polite conversation and the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain. For a few minutes no one said anything that mattered. Daniel's mother passed the bread basket, her movements smooth and practiced. "Emily, help yourself," she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," I replied, taking a small piece. His father carved the chicken with careful precision, placing portions on each plate, as if it were part of a routine he'd followed for years. There was a rhythm to the table, one that didn't include me yet. I waited. In my experience, people rarely show you who they are in the first 5 minutes. It's what comes after, when comfort sets in, when assumptions take hold, that tells the truth. So his mother said, finally settling into her chair, "How long have you been in the army?" "A little over 15 years, I answered. That was true. She raised her eyebrows slightly. "That's quite a long time for administrative work." "I've moved around a bit," I said. "Different assignments." His father nodded, but there was something behind it. Not approval, not quite skepticism either, just calculation. "And do you plan to stay in that role?" he asked. "For now, yes." Another pause, another shift. Daniel cleared his throat. "Emily's work is more complicated than that, actually." "It's all right," I said gently, placing my hand lightly over his wrist for just a moment. "I'm comfortable with what I do." That quieted him. But it didn't go unnoticed. His mother gave a small, polite smile. Of course. Stability is important, especially for a young couple thinking about the future. There it was again. Not unkind, not openly critical, but layered. "I agree," I said simply. She studied me for a second longer than necessary. "And your family, are they nearby?" "No, ma'am, they're back in Ohio." "Oh," she said, "small town." "Yes." That must have been quite an adjustment, moving into all this. Her hand gestured lightly around the dining room. "It was," I said, "but you get used to change." That answer seemed to settle something for her. Across the table, Daniel shifted in his seat. I could feel the tension building, not explosive, just quiet and persistent, like pressure behind a closed door. His father took a sip of wine before speaking again. "Daniel mentioned you met through mutual friends." "Yes, sir." "And how long have you been together?" "Just over a year." He nodded slowly. "A year isn't very long." "No," I agreed. Another pause. His mother set down her fork. "You'll have to forgive us," she said with a soft laugh. "We're just protective of our son." "I understand," I said. And I did. But understanding didn't mean accepting everything that came with it. "Daniel has always been very driven," she continued. "We've always encouraged him to aim high. I can see that. And we want to make sure he has a partner who can support that." There it was, said gently, carefully, but clearly. I met her gaze. Support comes in many forms. Her smile tightened just slightly. "Of course." Daniel finally spoke up. "Mom." "It's all right," I said again, calm but firm. "I appreciate your honesty." The table fell quiet for a moment. His father leaned back, folding his hands together. "In our experience," he said, "shared ambition is important in a marriage." "I agree," I said. He seemed almost surprised by that. "But ambition doesn't always look the same from the outside." That earned me a longer look. "What does it look like for you?" he asked. I considered the question for a moment. "It looks like commitment," I said. "Consistency, doing your job well even when no one is watching." That sounds admirable, his mother said, though not particularly visible. I allowed a small smile. Not everything that matters is. Silence again. But this time it felt different. Not just evaluation, but resistance. Halfway through the meal, Daniel's cousin Mark arrived. Late 30s, loud personality, the kind of man who filled a room without trying. "Sorry I'm late," he said, dropping into the empty chair beside me. "Work ran long." He gave me a quick glance. "You must be Emily." "Yes." "Mark," he said, offering his hand. "I've heard a little about you." "Only the good parts, I hope." He laughed. "Depends who you ask." Within minutes, he had taken over the conversation, steering it toward business investments and career paths. It didn't take long before the topic circled back to me. "So, Emily," he said, leaning back in his chair, "what do you do again?" "Administration in the Army." Daniel's mother answered before I could. Mark raised his eyebrows. "Ah, paperwork, huh?" "Among other things," I said. He grinned. "Well, someone's got to keep the machine running." I nodded. "That's true." He chuckled, clearly amused by his own comment. "I always figured the real action was somewhere else." "It depends on what you consider action," I replied. He waved it off. "Fair enough." But the tone had been set. From that point on, I became background. Not ignored entirely, just placed. Questions shifted away from me. Conversations moved around me. Decisions about what mattered had already been made. Daniel tried once or twice to pull me back in. "Emily has a lot of responsibility, actually." But his voice didn't carry the weight it needed to. And I didn't push. Because I was watching, listening, learning. Toward the end of the meal, his mother brought out dessert homemade pie neatly sliced. "Emily," she said, setting a plate in front of me, "do you cook?" "Yes, ma'am." "What kind of dishes?" "Mostly simple ones, things I grew up with." She nodded. "That's nice." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Daniel's schedule can be demanding. He'll need someone who can manage a home efficiently." I looked at her steadily. I've managed more complex systems than a household. The words came out before I softened them. "A small mistake." Her smile didn't change, but her eyes did. "I'm sure you have," she said. But the meaning was clear. Not in the way you think. The plates were cleared, chairs shifted, the evening moved toward its natural close. But the air hadn't eased. If anything, it had settled into something firmer, defined. Daniel walked me toward the hallway while his parents stepped into the kitchen. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "They're just like that." "I know." "You didn't have to." "I did," I said gently. He looked at me, searching for something he couldn't quite name. "Did what he asked." I held his gaze for a moment. "Let them show me who they are." Before he could respond, my phone vibrated in my hand. I glanced down at the screen. And everything shifted. Because I knew that number. And calls like that didn't come without a reason. I took a slow breath. "Excuse me," I said, stepping away. As I walked toward the quiet corner of the hallway, I answered the call. "Yes." The voice on the other end was urgent but controlled. And in that moment I understood. This dinner was about to become something else entirely. "Yes, ma'am," the voice on the other end said. "We've got a situation developing. I need your guidance." I stepped a little farther down the hallway, lowering my voice just enough to keep the conversation private, but not so quiet that it sounded secretive. "What's the scope?" I asked. There was a brief pause, then a clear, concise response. "Preliminary reports indicate a containment issue on the south side of the base. Nothing public yet, but it's escalating. Command is asking for direction." I closed my eyes for a second, not in stress, but in focus. This was familiar ground, controlled pressure, limited time, decisions that mattered. "Who's on site?" I asked. "Colonel Harris is leading initial response. He's waiting on authorization to move resources." "Tell him he has it," I said, "but keep it contained. No unnecessary exposure. I want a full report within the hour." "Yes, ma'am." "And keep this off open channels." "Understood." The line went quiet for a moment, then returned with a softer tone. "We'll handle it." "I know you will," I said. The call ended. I stood there for a second longer, letting the shift settle. Then I turned back toward the dining room. The moment I stepped back in, I felt it. Not suspicion, not yet. But attention. Daniel was watching me closely. His parents had resumed their seats, though the conversation hadn't fully picked back up. Everything all right? His mother asked. Yes, ma'am, I said, taking my seat again. Just something from work. She nodded, but there was a new layer in her expression now. Curiosity sharpened. Must be important, Mark added lightly. Sounded serious. Sometimes it is, I replied. He gave a small shrug, clearly not interested in pressing further. But his father was. What exactly do you handle? He asked. There it was again. The question. I folded my hands lightly in my lap. Administrative coordination. He studied me, at this hour. Work doesn't always follow a schedule, I said. That's true, he admitted. But he didn't look convinced. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Like I said, her role's more involved than it sounds. I glanced at him, then back at the table. It's nothing unusual. That answer seemed to close the door for now. But not entirely. Dessert resumed, though the tone had shifted. Subtle, quiet. But different. Mark tapped his fork lightly against his plate. You know, I've always wondered how the military handles stuff like that, late calls, emergencies, all that. It depends on the situation, I said. Seems stressful. It can be. He nodded. I don't think I could do it. I smiled faintly. You'd be surprised what people can handle when they have to. He chuckled. Maybe. But he didn't press further. His mother, however, had gone quiet. She watched me now, not with dismissal, but with calculation. Something didn't fit anymore. And she knew it. After dessert, we moved back into the sitting room. Coffee was served. The evening was supposed to wind down. But instead, it tightened. Daniel sat beside me closer than before. His hand rested lightly near mine, not touching, but present. His father took his usual chair, crossing one leg over the other. So he said after a moment, Daniel tells us you've been considering next steps. I knew what he meant. Yes, sir. Marriage is a serious commitment. I agree. And it requires a certain level of alignment. I met his gaze. In what sense? In lifestyle, expectations, long-term planning. I nodded. Those things matter. And do you feel your current role supports that, he asked? The question wasn't about my job. Not really. It was about value. I answered carefully. I believe I bring stability, discipline, and commitment into any situation I'm part of. His expression didn't change. But I added gently. He leaned forward slightly. But I'm not sure I understand how your position fits into the kind of future Daniel has been building. There it was. Clear, direct. No more soft edges. Daniel shifted beside me. Dad. It's a fair question, I said calmly. He paused, perhaps expecting resistance. Instead, I continued. You're asking whether I meet your expectations. I'm asking whether you're the right partner for my son. I held his gaze. That depends, I said. On what? On whether you're evaluating me based on who I am or what you assume I am. The room went still. Mark let out a quiet breath. Daniel's mother set her cup down carefully. His father's eyes narrowed just slightly. And which do you think it is, he asked. I think I said evenly, you've made a decision without having all the information. He leaned back again. Then perhaps you should provide it. A simple statement. But heavy. Daniel looked at me, his expression caught somewhere between concern and curiosity. He didn't know everything. Not fully. I had told him enough, but not all. Not like this. Not in this room. I could feel the moment building. The line approaching. I had planned to wait. To observe. To leave with quiet conclusions. But plans don't always hold. Not when pressure changes. His mother spoke next, her tone softer but no less pointed. Emily, she said, we don't mean to make you uncomfortable. We just want what's best for Daniel. I understand, I said. And from what we've seen, we're not sure you fully align with that. There it was. Not cruel, but final. A judgment. I took a slow breath. Not out of frustration, but clarity. Because in that moment I knew something important. They weren't bad people. They were just certain. Certain of how the world worked. Certain of what success looked like. Certain of what mattered. And they had placed me outside of that. Without knowing. Without asking. I set my cup down gently. May I ask you something, I said? His father nodded. If I had told you something different earlier about my work, would this conversation be different? He didn't hesitate. Yes. Honest. At least that. And that's exactly why I didn't, I said quietly. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Not tense. Just real. Daniel turned toward me fully now. Emily. I met his eyes briefly. Then I looked back at his parents. There are things about my work that aren't easy to explain in a few sentences, I said, and I didn't feel the need to lead with them tonight. His father folded his hands together. Then perhaps now would be the time. The room waited. Every eye on me. Every assumption hanging in the air. I could have said it plainly. I could have ended the uncertainty in a single sentence. But something held me back. Not hesitation. Not fear. Just timing. Because the truth once spoken doesn't just inform. It changes everything. And I wasn't sure they were ready for that. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated again. Same number. Same urgency. I glanced down. Then back up. Excuse me, I said. I stood stepping away from the room once more. But this time, I knew they were listening. I answered. Yes. The voice came through immediately. Yes, ma'am. Situation is escalating. We need confirmation on next steps now. I didn't lower my voice this time. I didn't step as far away. Proceed with containment, I said clearly. Authorize full response. I'll take command when I arrive. Yes, ma'am. I ended the call. Turned. And walked back into the room. No one spoke. Because now, they had heard enough to know. Something wasn't what it seemed. When I stepped back into the living room, I didn't rush to sit down. For a moment, I simply stood there. Not to make a point, not to create a scene, but because I understood very clearly that the room I had walked out of was not the same one I was walking back into. Daniel's mother was still holding her coffee cup, though she hadn't taken a sip. His father sat straighter now, his posture no longer relaxed. Mark had stopped pretending to be casual, his attention fixed directly on me. And Daniel, he was looking at me like he was seeing something for the first time. Not entirely new, but not entirely familiar either. I took a step forward and returned to my seat, placing my phone calmly beside my cup. No one spoke right away. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but expectant. Finally, his father cleared his throat. That sounded significant, he said. I nodded once. It is. He leaned forward slightly, care to elaborate. There it was. The invitation. Or perhaps the request. I folded my hands together on the table, resting them lightly against each other. I handle situations that require coordination, I said. Mark let out a small disbelieving laugh. That's one way to put it. I met his gaze not unkindly. It's an accurate one. His smile faded just a little. Daniel shifted beside me. Emily, what exactly is going on? His tone wasn't accusatory, it was searching. I turned to him. There's an issue at the base, I said. It's being managed. You said you'd take command, he replied quietly. Yes. That single word changed something. I saw it land. Not just with him. With everyone. His mother set her cup down more carefully this time. You're in charge of something like that. Sometimes I said. His father studied me now, not with dismissal but with focus. That's not typical for administrative personnel, he said. No, I agreed, it isn't. Another pause. He waited. And this time I didn't deflect. I didn't soften. I simply spoke. I didn't come here tonight to mislead anyone, I said calmly, but I also didn't feel the need to introduce myself by my title. Daniel's voice was quieter now. What title? I turned to him fully. And for the first time since I had walked into that house, I answered without holding anything back. I'm a 2-star general, I said, in the United States Army. The words settled into the room like something physical. Heavy. Real. And impossible to ignore. Mark blinked. Once. Twice. As if waiting for a punchline that never came. Daniel's mother didn't move at all. And his father simply stared. You're serious, he said after a moment. Yes, sir. The silence that followed was different from the others. Not tense. Not uncertain. Just undeniable. Because there are certain truths that don't leave room for interpretation. And that was one of them. Mark leaned back slowly in his chair. That's not something people usually leave out. I wasn't trying to hide it, I said. I just didn't think it should define the conversation. He gave a short laugh, though it didn't carry the same confidence as before. Well, it kind of does now. I didn't respond to that. Because he wasn't wrong. Across from me, Daniel's mother finally spoke. You're telling us, she said carefully, that you command troops. Yes, ma'am. How many? Enough that it matters. That answer wasn't meant to be evasive. It was meant to be respectful. She absorbed it slowly. And you've been doing this while presenting yourself as someone who works in administration, I finished gently. Which is still true, just not the whole picture. Her eyes moved over me again, but this time the assessment was different. Not dismissive. Reevaluating. His father exhaled quietly, leaning back into his chair. I see, he said. 2 simple words. But they carried weight. Because what he saw now wasn't what he had expected. Daniel hadn't said anything. Not yet. I turned toward him again. I didn't tell you everything I said, and I understand if that feels like a breach of trust. He looked at me, his expression caught between disbelief and something deeper. You told me enough, he said slowly. I just didn't realize how much more there was. That's fair. Why not just say it, he asked. Because I needed to know something first. What? I met his eyes. Who you were when none of it mattered. He held my gaze for a long moment, then nodded once. Not fully satisfied, but understanding. His father leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees. You understand how this looks from our perspective, he said. I do. You come into our home, present yourself one way, and then I present myself as I am, I said calmly, just without context. That's not a small omission. No, I agreed, it isn't. He studied me carefully. And what exactly were you hoping to learn? I considered the question. Whether I would be treated with respect, I said, before any titles were involved. The honesty in that answer landed harder than anything else I had said that evening. Because it wasn't about power. It wasn't about position. It was about something simpler. And more revealing. His mother shifted slightly in her seat. We didn't mean any disrespect, she said. I know, I replied. But you have to understand, she continued, we were trying to evaluate. Me, I said. Yes. And now I asked. She hesitated. Because now, the evaluation had changed. Not just in outcome, but in direction. Mark cleared his throat. Well, I guess that explains the phone calls. Yes, I said. And the take command part, he added. Yes. He shook his head slowly. Didn't see that coming. That was the point, I said quietly. The room settled again. But this time there was no returning to what it had been. Because once assumptions break, they don't rebuild the same way. Daniel's father stood up after a moment, walking slowly toward the window. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood there looking out at the darkening yard. Then finally he spoke. I may have misjudged you, he said. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was movement. And sometimes that's where change begins. I nodded once. We all make judgments, I said. The question is what we do after. He turned slightly, considering that. Daniel's mother looked at me again. But now there was no trace of dismissal. Only reconsideration. And perhaps something else. Something quieter. I picked up my cup, taking a slow sip. The coffee had gone cold. But I didn't mind. Because the evening had shifted. Not into conflict. Not into triumph. But into something far more real. The moment after the truth is known. When people have to decide who they are going to be next. For a while no one spoke. It wasn't the strained silence from earlier in the evening. It was heavier than that, more deliberate, the kind that settles in after something shifts and everyone is trying to understand what it means. Daniel's father was still by the window, his back to us, one hand resting lightly against the frame. His shoulders had lost that rigid certainty from before. His mother sat across from me, hands folded, now her posture straighter, not out of formality but awareness. Mark looked down at his empty cup, then back up at me as if trying to recalibrate everything he'd said over the past hour. And Daniel? He hadn't moved. He was still turned toward me, his expression quieter than I had ever seen it. Not angry. Not even upset. Just processing. I set my cup down gently. I didn't mean to create a situation, I said. That wasn't my intention. Daniel's mother shook her head slowly. You didn't, she said. Not exactly. She paused, then added, but you did show us something we weren't expecting. I nodded once. That's fair. Mark let out a short breath. I'll be honest, I feel a little ridiculous. That wasn't the goal either, I said. He gave a small self-aware smile, still. Across the room, Daniel's father turned back toward us. I think he said carefully we may have approached this the wrong way. No one responded immediately, because those words, simple as they were, carried weight. He walked back toward the table slower than before and took his seat again. I've spent most of my life evaluating people quickly, he continued. It's how I was trained. Business, negotiations. You learn to assess value risk potential. I listened. And tonight he said I did exactly that. His gaze met mine. But I did it without all the information. I held his eyes. Yes, sir, I said quietly. You did. There was no accusation in my voice. Just truth. He exhaled slowly, and I let that judgment shape how I treated you. This time the room stayed silent a little longer. Because now, we were no longer talking about assumptions. We were talking about responsibility. Daniel shifted beside me. Dad? But his father raised a hand slightly, not to stop him, but to finish his thought. I don't like being wrong, he said. But I dislike even more the idea that I was unfair. I considered that. Then I nodded. That matters, I said. His mother looked between us, her expression softer now. We weren't trying to be unkind, she said. I know, I replied. But we were, she admitted. That was the first real acknowledgement. And it didn't come with defensiveness. Just honesty. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. I should have said something earlier, he said, when I saw where the conversation was going. I turned toward him. You tried. Not enough, he said. I didn't argue with that. Because growth doesn't come from being reassured, it comes from being aware. He looked at me again. I didn't fully understand what you do. Not like this. That's on me, I said. I chose not to explain it. Why, he asked again more quietly this time. I took a breath. Because I needed to know if you saw me, before everything else. And I held his gaze. I think you're still figuring that out. He didn't flinch. He nodded once. That's fair. Mark cleared his throat again, shifting in his seat. So, just so I'm clear, he said, glancing between us, you're actually in charge of a base. Yes. And those calls are part of the job. He let out a low whistle. I made a joke about paperwork. I remember, I said. He winced slightly. Yeah, about that. It's all right, I said. You were working with the information you had. That's not much of an excuse, he replied. No, I agreed, but it is an explanation. He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Daniel's mother reached for her cup again, though her hands moved more carefully now. I think she said we've spent a long time measuring people by things that are easy to see. I didn't interrupt. And we forgot that not everything important presents itself that way. Her eyes met mine. That's on us. I inclined my head slightly. It takes awareness to recognize that. It took you showing us, she said. That wasn't my intention, I replied. Maybe not, she said, but it was the result. Daniel's father leaned forward again, his tone steadier now. You said earlier, he began, that you wanted to see who we were, before we knew who you were. Yes, sir? And now you have... I do. He held my gaze. And what have you concluded? The question wasn't defensive. It was direct. And it deserved a direct answer. I considered my words carefully. I think you care deeply about your son, I said, and you want to protect what he's built. He nodded once. But I also think, I continued, that you rely heavily on visible markers to determine someone's worth. He didn't argue, because he knew it was true. And that can lead to incomplete conclusions. The room stayed quiet, because sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest to respond to. After a moment, he spoke again. You're not wrong. It wasn't easy for him to say. That much was clear. I've spent decades building a certain way of thinking, he added. It doesn't change overnight. I wouldn't expect it to, I said. But it can change, he said. Yes. That word carried more weight than anything else in the conversation. Because it wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. Daniel reached for my hand this time gently. Not out of habit. Out of intention. I'm still here, he said quietly. I know, I replied. And I'm not going anywhere. I looked at him for a long moment. Then stand with me, I said. Not a demand. Not a test. Just a truth. He nodded. I will. The tension that had filled the house earlier was gone. Not replaced with comfort. Not yet. But with something more important. Honesty. And the beginning of understanding. As the evening drew toward its close, things felt different. Not lighter, but clearer. And sometimes that's what matters most. Because clarity doesn't erase what happened, but it gives you a chance to decide what to do with it. When we finally stood to leave, Daniel's mother walked us to the door. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for having me, I replied. This time the words carried more meaning. She hesitated for a brief moment, then added, We'd like to see you again soon. I nodded, I'd like that. And I meant it. Because this wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about whether something real could grow from what had been revealed. Outside, the air was cool and quiet. Daniel opened the car door for me again just as he had earlier. But this time the gesture felt different. Less practiced. More present. As I settled into the seat, I looked back at the house one last time. Not with judgment. Not with satisfaction. But with a quiet understanding. Because tonight hadn't been about showing who I was. It had been about showing something else entirely. What people reveal when they think you don't matter. And what they do when they realize you do. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. Daniel kept both hands on the wheel, eyes forward, jaw set, in that way men sometimes have when they are trying to think and not speak too soon. I appreciated that about him. A careless sentence can bruise more deeply than a hard one, especially after a night like that. I watched the road lights pass across the windshield in long yellow streaks. For most people, the evening would have felt like a victory. A room full of people had underestimated me. Then they had learned the truth. Their faces had changed, their tone had changed, their certainty had cracked. That is the kind of moment some people wait years for. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. Not physically. I had worked longer days under far worse pressure. This was different. This was the quiet kind of tired that comes when you realize love does not only ask whether two people care for each other. It asks whether they can stand together when other people make that difficult. Daniel finally spoke when we stopped at a red light. I should have told them more before tonight. I looked at him. He didn't turn toward me. Not your rank. That wasn't mine to tell. But I should have prepared them better. Or at least warned you more clearly about how they could be. I had a sense. That's not the same. No, I said, it isn't. The light turned green. He drove on. After a few more seconds, he said, Were you testing me too? I took my time before answering. Yes. He absorbed that without reacting. I figured, he said quietly. I wasn't trying to trap you. I know. But I needed to see whether you would let me sit there alone. That one hurt him. I saw it in his face, even in the dim light. I did, he said. Not completely. But enough. I didn't answer right away because there was no kindness in pretending he was wrong. Yes, I said, enough. He swallowed and nodded. That was one thing I had always respected about Daniel. He could be proud, but he wasn't dishonest with himself once the truth found him. I froze, he said. I kept thinking if I pushed back too hard it would make things worse. That's a common mistake, I said softly. He gave a sad little laugh. That sounds like something you'd say in a briefing. It probably is. For the first time all night, a small warmth passed between us. Then it faded back into seriousness. I love my parents, he said, but I saw it tonight. I saw what they were doing. And what were they doing? They were measuring you. I nodded. And I let them, he added. That's the part you need to remember. He pulled into the parking lot of my building a few minutes later but didn't turn off the engine right away. I don't want a marriage where you have to defend yourself alone, he said. Neither do I. I don't want you to feel like you have to hide who you are around my family. I didn't hide because of them, I said. I withheld because of what I needed to learn. He turned toward me then. And what did you learn about me? I looked at him for a long moment. That you love me, I said. But love needs a backbone. He looked down at his hands. That's fair. It's not meant to wound you. I know, he said, but it should. That answer stayed with me. Because sometimes a wound is not punishment. Sometimes it is the place where growth begins. 2 days passed before his mother called. I was in my office at the base when my assistant knocked lightly and opened the door. Ma'am, Daniel's mother is on your personal line. I looked up from the folder in front of me. That surprised me. Thank you. Put her through. A moment later, her voice came over the phone. Emily. Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. There was a pause. Please call me Patricia. I leaned back slightly. All right, Patricia. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. I looked at the stack of reports on my desk, then at the clock. You're all right. Another pause. I wanted to apologize. I said nothing. Not because I wanted to make her uncomfortable, but because an apology deserves room. Too often, people rush to rescue others from the hard part of saying it. She continued. I judged you before I knew you. I asked questions that sounded polite but were not kind, and I made assumptions about your worth based on a dress, a job title, and my own narrow idea of what success looks like. Her voice wavered slightly at the end. That mattered. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I've been thinking about it since you left. Harold has too, though he is slower to admit things. That made me smile faintly. I understand. I don't expect you to forget it. I won't. No, she said softly. I suppose you shouldn't. There was honesty in that too. Then she asked, would you consider coming to dinner again, just you and Daniel? No cousin, no interrogation, just dinner. I looked through the window of my office out toward the flag, moving in the afternoon wind. I would consider it, I said. That's more than I deserve. Maybe, I replied, but it's enough for a start. That evening, Daniel came over with takeout from a little Italian place near my building. He brought 2 paper bags, one tired smile, and no excuses. We ate at my kitchen table, the kind with one uneven leg and a scratch near the corner from when I had moved it myself after a long deployment. Halfway through dinner, he said, Mom called you. She did. She called me after. I waited. She said she apologized. She did. He nodded. Dad wants to talk too, in person. That will be harder for him. I know. Are you ready for that? He looked at me. I think I am. That wasn't my question. He set his fork down. Then he said, I'm ready to stand beside you this time. I believed he meant it. But life had taught me that meaning well is only the first step. The real test comes when comfort is threatened, when family disapproves, when old patterns ask to be obeyed. So I didn't say good. I didn't say that fixes it. I simply reached across the table and took his hand. We'll see, I said. He nodded. And for now, that was enough. The second dinner happened the following Sunday. This time I did not wear the old dress. I also did not wear a uniform. I chose a simple gray blouse, dark slacks, and a necklace my mother had given me before she passed. Nothing flashy, nothing hidden, just me. When Daniel and I arrived, his father opened the door. Harold Whitmore looked smaller than he had the first night. Not weak, just less armored. Emily, he said. Mr. Whitmore. He stepped aside. Please come in. The house looked the same, but it felt different. There were no extra guests, no performative table setting, no cousin making jokes from the side. Patricia greeted me in the kitchen with a sincere hug that lasted just long enough to be awkward, but not false. Dinner was simple, pot roast potatoes, green beans. Real food, no performance. For a while we talked about ordinary things. Weather, Daniel's work, a neighbor's old maple tree coming down in the last storm. Then Harold set down his fork. I owe you an apology, he said. Everyone went still. He looked directly at me. I measured you by the wrong things. Worse than that, I allowed my pride to make me comfortable doing it. I listened, hands resting in my lap. I have spent years telling myself I'm a good judge of character, he continued. But that night I was not judging character. I was judging status. His voice grew quieter. And if you had not turned out to be someone important, I might never have seen the problem. That was the first thing he said that truly reached me. Because it was the truth beneath the truth. I nodded slowly. That matters more than the apology, I said. He looked confused. I explained, "You didn't just regret misjudging a general. You recognized you would have owed the same respect to an administrative worker." His face tightened with feeling. "Yes," he said, "that's what I'm trying to learn." And in that moment I believed him. Not completely. Not perfectly. But enough to begin. The second dinner ended without tension. That more than anything told me something had shifted. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. When Daniel and I stepped out onto the front porch, Patricia followed us to the door again. This time her smile wasn't measured or polite, it was softer, uncertain, but real. "I'm glad you came," she said. "So am I replied. And I meant it. Because reconciliation doesn't always feel warm at first. Sometimes it feels like two people choosing not to walk away. Harold stood just behind her, one hand resting on the doorframe. He didn't say much as we left, but he gave a small nod. It was a simple gesture. But it carried weight. The drive home felt different from the one a week before. There was still quiet between Daniel and me, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was thoughtful, settled. After a few minutes, he reached over and took my hand without looking away from the road. "They meant it," he said. "I know. I've never seen my dad talk like that. People change when they're willing to see themselves clearly." He let out a slow breath. I almost didn't. I turned toward him, "But you did." "Because of you." "No," I said gently, "because you chose to." That mattered. Because change forced by someone else rarely lasts. But change chosen, earned, that stays. He nodded slightly as if storing that away. "I don't want to ever put you in that position again," he said. "You will," I replied calmly. He blinked. "What?" I smiled faintly. "Not like that, but life has a way of testing people in different forms." He thought about that. "So what do I do when it happens again?" "Stand sooner," I said. "Speak earlier. Don't wait for things to become uncomfortable before you decide what you believe." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. "I can do that." "I believe you can." A few weeks passed. Life returned to its usual rhythm. Early mornings, long days, brief calls that carried more weight than words, the steady responsibility that came with a role I had never taken lightly. At the base, nothing had changed. Rank still mattered. Decisions still had consequences. People still stood when I entered a room. But something inside me had settled differently. Because outside of that world beyond the gates, beyond the structure, I had been reminded of something just as important. Who you are when none of that is visible. And how people treat you when they don't know. One afternoon as I was reviewing a set of reports, my assistant stepped in. "Ma'am, you have a visitor." I glanced up. "Who is it?" "Mr. Whitmore." I paused for a fraction of a second. "Send him in." Harold stepped into my office with a level of formality that hadn't been there before. Not stiff, just respectful. "General," he said. "Mr. Whitmore." He looked around briefly, taking in the room, the flags, the maps, the quiet order of everything. "This is impressive," he said. "It's functional," I replied. He gave a small nod, then sat when I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "I didn't come to take much of your time," he said. "You're here. That means it matters." He accepted that. For a moment he seemed to search for the right words. "I've been thinking a lot," he said finally. "About that night, about how easily I made up my mind about you." I listened. "I built a career on reading people," he continued, "and I got comfortable believing I was good at it. That happens. But I wasn't reading you," he said. "I was reading what I expected to see." "That's more common than you think." He nodded slowly. "I wanted to thank you," he said. That surprised me. "For what?" "For not using your position to make a point." I leaned back slightly. That wouldn't have taught anything. "No," he agreed. "It would have just made me defensive." "That's not the same as learning." He let out a quiet breath. "Exactly." There was a pause. Then he added, "I've been trying to look at people differently since then." "How so?" "By asking myself one question first." I waited. "What if I'm wrong?" I nodded. "That's a good place to start." When he left, I sat there for a few minutes longer than usual. Not thinking about work, not thinking about rank. Just reflecting. Because in all my years of service, I had learned a great deal about leadership. About responsibility. About making decisions when the cost of being wrong was high. But that night and everything that followed had reminded me of something just as important. That leadership doesn't begin with authority. It begins with how you see people, and whether you give them the dignity of being more than your first impression. A month later, Daniel and I stood together at a small family gathering. Nothing formal, just a backyard barbecue at his parents' house. This time there were no questions about my job. No careful evaluations. No quiet tests. Instead, Patricia handed me a plate and asked about my week. Mark, still a little embarrassed, kept his jokes light and harmless. And Harold simply treated me as part of the family. Not because of what I was, but because of who I had shown myself to be, and who he had chosen to become. As the sun began to set, Daniel stepped closer to me, his hand resting lightly at my back. "You were right," he said. "About what?" "That night wasn't about proving who you are." I looked at him. "It was about showing who everyone else was." I smiled softly. "And what we chose to do after that." He nodded. "And I'm glad we didn't walk away." "So am I. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. People will show you who they are when they think you have nothing to offer them. That moment, quiet, unguarded, is where truth lives. But what matters more is what happens next. Whether they stay the same, or choose to grow, and whether you give them the space to do it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been judged too quickly, or if you've ever had to face your own assumptions, take a moment to reflect on it. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. Because sometimes the smallest shift in how we see each other can change everything.